So in my attempt to have my Christian apologist character present the best defense of Christianity that I possibly could, I took 4 steps. First, I read the works of a number of Christian apologists and philosophers, and I worked their arguments into the text of my proselytizer. The apologists I use include Justin Martyr, Tertullian, St. Augustine, St. Anselm, Martin Luther, Thomas Merton, C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, J.P. Moreland, Lee Strobel, Lynn Anderson, Norman Geisler, Peter Kreeft, Rabbi Zacharias, and William Lane Craig. Second, after I incorporated the arguments of these Christian apologists and philosophers into my book's text, I then joined a Christian Yahoo discussion group. And I presented my skeptics' arguments and then my Christians' counter-arguments, and I asked if anyone could help me improve upon my Christians' counter-arguments. And I did get lots of valuable feedback from the Christians in that group. Third, I always reviewed the final text of my proselytizer with several of my Christian friends and coworkers, because I always wanted to make sure that the dialogue of my Christian character always got something like a Christian seal of approval. And I say something like a Christian seal of approval because for many issues, different Christians will interpret different things differently, so it's probably impossible to get this seal of approval with a capital A. But I did make sure to get at least several Christian seals of approval with lowercase a's for everything that my Christian character says. And last, many of the Christian viewers of the 2007 YouTube videos that I made, many of these Christians made some very good comments and offered perspectives that I'd often failed to include in my 2006 edition of Dialogue with the Christian Proselytizer. So I incorporated many of those comments and perspectives into the 2008 edition. Now, in writing the text for my Christian apologist, I felt kind of like a defense attorney for a client who, as far as I can tell, really does not have the evidence on his side. But even still, I wanted to do the best job within my limits at presenting his side of the story, and then we'll just let the jury take it from there. Now, as for how well the best Christian answers stand up to scrutiny, again, the best to my ability, it's been my experience that this largely depends on whether or not the jury members, so to speak, have the preconceived conviction that the Judeo-Christian Bible is God's inerrant word. Because if you already feel you know the Bible is God's word, then the answers from my apologists seem to stand up fairly well. At least all the Christians that I reviewed my book with told me that my Christian apologist does a good job at defending the Bible as not being clueless about the universe and containing no irrational prejudices and showing no signs of borrowing from previous existing religions. Now, I have to add here that this is probably more true of my fundamentalist Christian friends and coworkers. The Christians I know who fall more into the category of cafeteria Christians. And by cafeteria Christians, I mean those who pick and choose which doctrine they're going to accept and which they're going to reject. Those Christians weren't quite as unanimously in support of my Christian characters. But all my fundamentalist Christian associates told me that my apologist wins every point that's debated. And, well, for what it's worth, the 2 Christians who reviewed my book on Amazon both gave it 5 stars. On the other hand, when it comes to those who do not have this preconceived conviction that the Bible is God's word, those people generally don't come to the conclusion, or that is, they generally come to the conclusion that even Christianity's best answers don't hold up to scrutiny. Now, I'm going to give an example from my book in which every non-Christian I spoke with saw the skeptic as having the stronger argument, whereas every Christian I spoke with, or at least the fundamentalist Christians, saw my proselytizer as being the clear winner. This is the section where both the skeptic and the proselytizer have already looked through the non-Christian religions, and they agree that religious borrowing is a sign of purely human origins, and the 2 characters are then turning to the Judeo-Christian Bible. And the skeptic points out that the Bible contains this same characteristic in many ways, and one example of this is that in ancient pre-Christian, these so-called pagan religions, we can often find stories of unions between a male god and a mortal virgin maiden, and of offspring that was both human and God. And we can find examples of this in ancient Greek mythology and in Roman mythology and in Zoroastrianism. And in my book, I go through the specific examples and read the passages, which I won't do here. Anyway, all these stories predate the time period of Jesus by centuries. So to the skeptic, the chronology of the evidence suggests that when the New Testament authors wrote about Jesus having a male godfather and a mortal virgin mother, and that Jesus was both God and human, well, this strongly suggests that the New Testament authors were influenced by pre-existing religious beliefs, such as those held by the Greeks and the Romans and the Zoroastrians. Now, when I was first writing this section, I didn't know how my Christian apologists could possibly respond. It seemed a very inadequate answer to say something like, well, really the pagans just made up those fantastical stories about male gods like Zeus and Poseidon and the war god Mars, impregnating virgins, and that their offspring were both human and god. These stories about Perseus and Hercules and Romulus and Remus, just crazy made-up stories, pure fiction. But then centuries later, this incredible coincidence happened. The real male god author really did plant a seed in the real Virgin Mary, Virgin Maiden, who is named Mary. And Jesus really was both human and God. Now that answer, well, it just seemed lame to me. So I researched Christian apologetic literature to see if I could find a better answer. And I did find two approaches that were both improvements. One approach is that taken by early Christian church apologists, Tertullian and Justin Martyr. And they both wrote about how Satan must have added things like the virgin birth stories to the pagan religions in order to mislead people. And because Satan added these stories to this pagan religion centuries ahead of time, these practices are called plagiarism by anticipation. So in other words, the reason that works like Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, which were both written some 800 years before the New Testament documents appeared, the reason these contain stories about gods mating with virgin maidens and offspring that were both human and God is because Homer was inspired by Satan, and Satan wanted these stories in the Iliad and the Odyssey because Satan wanted New Testament readers to be confused and led astray, and for readers to just think that the New Testament was influenced by pre-existing mythology. Okay, that's one explanation. One Christian explanation. Some other Christians anyway, that I spoke with, took a totally different approach and told me that it was more likely that it was God who planted those virgin birth stories in pagan religions. But this was not to confuse or mislead us. It was because God was just prepping the pagans by giving hints of his truth ahead of time. And that way they would be more open to the truth of Jesus once he arrived. All right, to be continued in part 4.